Welcome, everyone. We will start in about a minute as folks come in. Welcome, welcome. We'll give it a few more seconds for folks to come in. Thank you for being here tonight. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Tracy Quarter. She, her pronouns. I work at the Action Center on Race and the Economy, or ACRE, and I am based in Oakland, and I want to welcome you tonight. We do have closed captioning tonight, so if you look on your screen, you can click closed caption for that option. And so tonight we're going to talk about the carceral cycles of harm, a teach-in on VAWA hosted by the People's Coalition for Safety and Freedom. Next slide. So tonight we're going to take you through who we are. We're going to review what VAWA is. We're going to have a fire panel discussion. I'm so excited, y'all. And then we're going to do our call to action about the people's process so that we know what comes next. Next slide. So I want everyone, if you know me, you know I love a visualization and I love to ground us together. So if you feel comfortable wherever you are, if you'll close your eyes, and if not, just relax your gaze, and we're gonna do a little exercise together. And so I wanna ask, have you ever slowed down for just a few seconds and thought about a great day? I want you to do that with me right now. Think about who's around you. What did you do on your day? What does it feel like? What does it taste like? Who do you see? What does it smell like? So I want you to sit with that image for just a moment. And now I want you to come back to me. And I really want you to sit in that feeling. I know that for me, I think about green space. I think about kids outside playing in a fire hydrant. I think about people laughing. I think about the smell of barbecue. And I want you to know what I don't think about. I don't think about police, and I don't think about prisons, because true public safety comes from all the things that you saw in your great day. So I want to ask this question, and I would love to see people put it in the chat and just share, where do you go to feel safe? And I'll give some folks a minute. We'll continue to go throughout the time. We just love for people to share in the chat, where do you go to feel safe? Next slide. So who the People's Coalition is. We are known as the People's Coalition, or PCSF. We're base building and member-led grassroots organizations. We're racial justice policy and advocacy institutions. We're mostly led by Black and queer-led organizations. We represent a cross-section of communities impacted by systems of criminalization and incarceration. And we're committed to transforming the justice system and redefining public safety so that we actually have justice. Next slide. And so here's our steering committee. A brief shout out. We have BYP 100, the Center for Popular Democracy, BAJI, Dream Defenders, the Leadership Conference, Law for Black Lives, Just Leadership USA, Policy Link, Justice Team Networks, National Council for Incarcerated Girls, and Action Center for Race and the Economy, ACRE, who I rep. Next slide. And I want folks to continue to look in that chat. I'm seeing beautiful, beautiful sharing, people with their families, people in their bed. I know I feel safe in my bed, and that's really important. And think about how these are our visions of safety, and what we need at the end of a long day. So let's talk about the 94 crime bill. It was passed obviously in 1994 by then President Bill Clinton. And I think I'm waiting a little bit for some more writing to come up. Some of the major components of the 94 crime bill, it implemented 3 strike rules and mandatory minimum sentences, truth in sentencing laws and incentives. It established the COPS program, which still gives $19 billion to expand policing in US cities. It authorized $10 billion in subsidies to expand state prisons. And these are billions with a B, y'all. It ended Pell Grants for those in prison. We're talking about the Violence Against Women Act, which it enacted. And it gave us the federal assault weapon ban. Next slide. So the People's Coalition aims to dismantle and replace racist, harmful, and punitive policies that have fueled the crisis of criminalization and incarceration facing the United States, with policies and budgets that invest in communities and decarcerate our country. And this is a big goal, y'all, but we're going to do it together. Next slide. So I want people to really think about this quote from Andrea James. I think about it in my work daily. We must acknowledge the centrality of violence and sexual abuse of women and girls, racism, poverty, and homophobia as drivers of the criminalization and incarceration of women and girls. If we do not, we will just be tinkering around the edges. Only when we step back and look at the complex, big picture will we be able to begin to undo some of the immeasurable harm that has been done and invest in resources to help our communities begin to heal and thrive. And again, y'all, that's from Andrea James. If you are not familiar with her work, get familiar. Next slide. So what is VAWA? Violence Against Women Act, like we said, was passed in 94, but it also has been reauthorized in 2000, 2005, 2013, 2019, and it has just been reintroduced for reauthorization this year. And it was passed in the era of, quote, tough on crime policies. So when the 94 crime bill was passed, Biden asked, I need something for women in the crime bill. And it was modeled after state legislation that was responding to lawsuits against police for not arresting perpetrators of intimate partner violence. And so some of its fundamental goals, which were not met, obviously, were to prevent violent crime, respond to the need of crime victims, learn more about crime, to change public attitudes, and it was primarily achieved through federal grant programs. It also, in that time, created an Office on Violence Against Women in the Department of Justice. So let's talk about some of those components of VAWA. So it had 2 major parts. It changes to written law, including criminalizing the definition of intimate partner violence, creating new federal crimes. It also gave more money to police departments, courts, prosecutors' offices, social programs, and others. So it awarded over $9 billion, with a B again, $9 billion in grants and cooperative agreements. And so some of those grants include, and it's going to pop up, STOP, which each state must allocate 25% for law enforcement, 25% for prosecution. That's 50% just for law enforcement and prosecution. 30% for victim services, 5 to state and local courts, and 15% discretionary. And as we know about discretionary funds, we can imagine where that 15% went. And then it also gave us the Sexual Assault Services Program, or some state coalitions, and tribal coalitions. Next slide. And under VAWA, domestic violence is defined felony or misdemeanor crimes of violence committed by a current or former spouse or intimate partner of the victim, by a person with whom the victim shares a child in common, by a person who's cohabitating with them or has cohabitated with the victim as a spouse or intimate partner. And if you look at this map, it really tells you, I know that you've heard folks say, if you call the police on intimate partner violence in some states, this tells you the discretion. So in states like Wisconsin, Washington State, Oregon, Maine, if police show up, then there's a mandatory arrest that must happen. In some of those orange states, it's up to the officer discretion. And in some of the what kind of shady or gray states, it's just like they're pro-arrest states. So it's not a mandatory arrest, but they are definitely pro-arrest. I'll give folks just 1 second to scan that. Okay. And so this was a tweet from Joe Biden. Oh no, you can go back. Sorry about that. This is a tweet from Joe Biden in 2019. He said, since the passage of VAWA, annual rates of domestic violence have dropped by 63%. The National Domestic Violence Hotline responds to more than 26,000 people a month, creating a safety net for survivors. We have made progress, but there is much to do right now. So that's the way Joe Biden talks about VAWA. Next slide. So when we get into this, I think it's important for us to talk about what are some of the root causes of violence against women. So economic distress and exploitation, which includes housing and job insecurity, state violence and other personally experienced violence, existing systems and structures of violence, so capitalism, classism, racism, sexism, heterosexism, transphobia, xenophobia, ageism, trauma in childhood or later in life by both the state and individuals, societal norms. And I want you to think back to that quote that we put up from Andrea James, and I think you see all of that in that quote. So does VAWA address root causes of intimate partner violence? Under VAWA, the state is the primary and often only response to domestic abuse. But we know that the state itself perpetuates violence. So VAWA exacerbates those conditions, which lead to intimate partner violence in the first place. Subjecting people to violence by the state in their homes and communities perpetuates the cycle of violence. A carceral solution is not comprehensive nor effective. It is actually not a solution. So, we have some critiques of VAWA. Criminalizing violence against women is not successful in stopping nor deterring this violence, nor repairing the harm done. The state cannot enact anti-violence. And given the history and function of policing, they should not be the go-to for this issue. At least half of incarcerated women are domestic violence survivors. Up to 90% in some states are survivors of one form of violence. So how should we approach this? We use an anti-carceral approach, understanding that all forms of interpersonal violence are rooted in those systems of violence. And you can read those here, we talked about them. Recognizing that the carceral state is the main institution that continues these cycles of violence by upholding the previously stated systems. And we can look to our own community to determine what needs are, which you'll hear a little bit more about. So some anti-carceral solutions: economic. So as we talked about the root causes, we can change those with housing, healthcare, child and elder care, living wage, accessible, safe employment, immigration status. We can also do community education, violence prevention and interruption programs, transformative justice. And so all of this, I'm going to kick it over to our amazing, amazing panel that's going to be moderated by Marbre. And you will hear a lot of these themes. So try to pick that up. Hear the solutions that we were talking about being put in action. So thank you all so much for being here. And again, I'm going to hand it over to Marbre.
I'm on mute. Beautiful. Thank you so much, Tracy, for that grounding. I'm incredibly excited. We have one of the most dynamic, dopest, firest panels ever. And these are folks who are on the front lines, both thinking about the implications of VAWA, as well as the actual implementation, and work every day in communities that are trying to think up and dream up and implement new ways of keeping ourselves safe. So I'm super excited to introduce the panel. We're going to go deep into what VAWA is, what it's done, what it hasn't done, and alternatives to a carceral solution to violence. So I want everyone, if they can, to come off camera for me. Andrea, Janae, Cecilia. Beautiful. Great. I think I see everyone. So y'all about to be blessed on the mic with some amazing folks. I'm going to just read their bios because I won't do it justice if I don't read them. So I'm going to start with Andrea. Andrea Ritchie is a Black lesbian immigrant and survivor of state and interpersonal violence who has spent the last 30 years contributing to documenting, researching, litigating, organizing, and advocating around policing and criminalization of Black women, girls, trans, and gender nonconforming people and women of color. Our second panelist is Janae. Janae, you on a wave so we can see who everyone is? Dope. Janae is an activist, scholar, social worker, and PhD candidate at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Her research focuses on the intersection of interpersonal and institutional violence among Black people of marginalized genders and the impact of survivors' sense of safety. Janae's work is grounded in her personal experience as a violent survivor and a commitment to an abolitionist praxis that does not rely on policing for safety. Janae's political home is BYP 100, shout out, a national member-based organization of 18 to 35-year-olds organizing through a Black queer feminist lens. So shout out to Janae and BYP 100. And then lastly, we're super blessed to have Celia. I'm so sorry. I just said your name completely wrong. Celia Colon.
Celia Colon.
Celia Colon. Thank you, Celia. Who is an Emmy Award nominee, an author, an educator, inspirational speaker, who is a progressive national social justice matter expert. She uses her unique life experience to advocate and support legislative policies that advance smart criminal justice reform. As a passionate community leader, mentor, mother, and grandmother, and organizer, she's reimagining what reentry can be. So we have an incredible collection of folks who are both have been on the front lines, who have organized around survivors, around violence, both state and interpersonal. And I think they're really experts on this topic of what can keep us safe and how do we think about and legislate around that. So I want to just really start by zooming out a little bit and thinking and talking about the principles and values that really underlie VAWA. And one of those is the idea that it is through more policing, through more cages, through more violence that we can cure or address interpersonal violence. I think we often talk about this idea of using violence to stop violence, especially state violence, as carceral feminism. And so I want to ask the whole panel, but start with Andrea, I think, around what is carceral feminism, what's the concept, and what is its relationship with VAWA?
Carceral feminism is exactly what you just said, Marbre. It's the notion that you can end violence with violence, that paying attention to something as a society means criminalizing it, that we value our lives by how long someone does in a cage for hurting us. And it's really a conscious decision to throw in with the punitive apparatus of the state as a mechanism for addressing harm in our communities. And it's a term that was coined by Elizabeth Bernstein, but if you really want to understand sort of how it came to be, I encourage people to read my sister in struggle, Beth Ritchie's work, Arrested Justice, Black Women, Violence, and Prison Nation, because it really sort of tracks what she describes as how we lost the movement. And most of what I learned about this, I learned from Incite, an organization that I was privileged to be in leadership of for some years, and that Beth co-founded, where really is founded in many ways as a rebuff or a resistance to carceral feminism, because folks recognize that any system that invested in punishment as a response to violence was going to disproportionately harm Black women, queer and trans people, and women, queer and trans people of color. And so that in fact is what's proven to be true from the stats that Tracy was looking at before. So that's kind of in a nutshell what carceral feminism is and where it comes from. And it really has been a point of contestation throughout the sort of modern day anti-violence movement since the 70s and 80s. And there's been lots of consequences that have been particularly harmful, most of all to survivors and to survivors of color, Indigenous survivors, of course, Black survivors, queer and trans survivors, and disabled survivors, and criminalized survivors, and migrant survivors. So I've just named the vast majority of survivors who have been disserved by carceral feminism, but it's something that people really double down on and invest in, and in part it's about upholding existing systems and power relations and sort of bargaining away the safety of the vast majority of survivors in the name of the safety of the very few, usually cisgender, usually white, usually non-migrant, relatively able-bodied survivors who get recognized as victims under the system that has been sort of grown exponentially under carceral feminism, and that are able to receive some modicum of protection. And even for them, that can fall apart if there's stats that show if you're drunk at the time, or if you're believed to be drunk or are using drugs at the time, then you kind of fall out of that category immediately of people who are protected by VAWA. So that's carceral feminism. Another place people can read a lot about it is an article by another co-founder of Insight, Mimi Kim, called Dancing the Carceral Creep. So
thank you so much for that, Andrea. And if folks are noticing, we have some dope facilitation in the chat box, all recommendations that Andrea mentioned, so y'all can Google it. So thank you, Nandi. I want to just I feel like you already kind of addressed this in your answer, Andrea, but I want to just ask you, Janae, as a follow-up to kind of explicitly name what are the racial implications of carceral feminism, and why is it that jails and cages and prisons and cops don't keep women and femmes safe when it comes to intimate violence?
Yeah, I think Andrea really covered what carceral feminism is pretty comprehensively. I would just add, in terms of the racial components and implications of it, something, if you read Beth Ritchie's work, who was just mentioned, she talks about this every woman rhetoric that kind of fueled the movement that led to VAWA as very problematic. And so this every woman rhetoric is essentially this idea that, like, violence can happen to anyone, which of course it can, right? But this assumption of every woman kind of fell into the vacuum of a white feminist analysis that was just devoid of any analysis on race and class. And so as gendered violence became more of a mainstream problem and more integrated into police, legal, and in social service agencies, the national dialogue on violence against women in particular became more so, every woman was a white middle class woman who could turn to a doctor or a therapist or even a police officer or the law generally to protect them, and that would be okay. But of course, we know intersectionality is a thing that we all need to be cognizant of all times. And so the way that the state interacts with someone who lives at the intersection of many different marginalized identities does not experience the state in the same way that a white woman does, or someone with more power and privilege. And so in turn, the racial components and implications of carceral feminism ignored the fact that Black people especially was already overrepresented and hyper just overrepresentative in state surveillance systems, in prisons, in jails. And so adding this criminal legal solution to violence just exacerbated that, not just for people who cause harm, but also people who experience harms. Things like mandatory arrests and dual arrests that happen, no drop prosecution laws wherein, you know, a survivor might say, like, I actually don't want to press charges against this person. This person is, I co-parent my children with this person. I'm financially dependent on this person. If they go to jail or prison, what am I supposed to do? And these no drop policies essentially say, we don't actually care what you want. We're pressing charges anyway, right? And so these elements of VAWA that really undermine autonomy and disempower the people that theoretically they were meant to help, you know, Black women and other women of color, transgender and non-conforming folks, they really get the short end of the stick where VAWA is concerned. And so in addition to that, I think that coordinated responses between law enforcement and victim advocates and social service agencies have also just been shown to disproportionately and negatively impact women of color, immigrant women, LGBTQ folks, and poor folks. So yeah, just criminalization just generally brought tangible benefits to a very small amount of people who experienced and were subjected to abuse. But ultimately, the criminal legal system fails to deter intimate partner violence, or really any type of violence. It actually perpetuates it. And you know, I think the harms of criminalization are significant enough to justify abandoning the use of the criminal legal system, you know, as a solution to violence in totality.
Yes, thank you. Preach that. I really appreciate that. And I think one thing you said is a really good bridge actually to my next question, which is the kind of common occurrence of the center of these policies of the police and the court, right? And so what women want when someone comes to their home and they're the survivor of abuse is really irrelevant to what happens to them, right? And so I want to ask kind of that question, Celia, of you around why is it so important that we center survivors and folks who are impacted in developing solutions? What is the mistake in centering the court system or police as the decision makers and the center of our approaches to ending interpersonal and domestic violence?
Well, I like to quote, of course, one of my good friends, Glenn Martin, you know, those closer to the problem are also closer to the solution, but furthest from the resource and the financial resource to, you know, implement change. And that's the honest to God truth. You know, we are the ones who are system survivors. We are the ones who are impacted. We know what we need. We don't need someone to dictate and try to tell us what we need when we know what's on our plate. No one knows what a survivor goes through. There's one thing that I don't care who wrote the book about trauma or what professor did their research about trauma. Every single person will come up with the same result, that trauma can destroy your life. And trauma affects everyone differently. And people heal from trauma differently. So what I need specifically for me as a brown woman, right, is not going to be what you or whatever you are needs, because we have total different biases, upbringing, values, belief. You don't know my personal background trauma that I've been through or witnessed, or, you know, none of these things. So when you're coming at me, you don't even know the whole totality of the story of what you're dealing with. When you come in, you're just dealing with that part right there. And that part doesn't play or give you the entire picture of what is happening at that moment. So for you to come in and dictate, you know, and decide what I need in my life, how is that a solution?
Thank you so much for that. And I feel like it's such a powerful point too, that these like solutions developed often by politicians who have no lived experience are really irrelevant and don't help or deal with the long line of trauma that leads to any given moment. And none of these address the root causes that bring us into interpersonal violence moments. And that by just locking folks up or responding with the police, that in fact we are abandoning kind of the long-standing trauma. How do we address that? So thank you so much for that.
Right. And I just wanted to say as well, there's not, and there hasn't been for years a gender, racial equity lens in these structural places. You know, at the end of the day, you know, we can be on panels and do all of this education. At the end of the day, all the laws that were built, you know, the bills, everything that we are constantly just pivoting or rewriting, but we never change or break and reconstruct what was created by white slave owners. And that's the bottom line. Like, people can stop sugarcoating shit and get to the center of the root causes. And when we start doing that and we're open and we have conversation and we're not placing blame, we're just coming up with solutions and say, this doesn't represent the diverse country that I live in and the needs that are needed right now for specific people, specific lenses. You know, when do they start centering policy with us directing it, system impacted, you know, from every lens, when we are the ones that are in them spaces leading and directing and then having the aid of others join us, then we're going to get somewhere.
Shay, thank you so much for that. And this need for transformation, that all of these solutions that don't actually address the root causes are bound to fail. And I think to Janae's point, create more violence. So thank you so much for that insight. I want to ask y'all about kind of VAWA specifically. And so we saw the quote from Joe Biden about how VAWA has ended domestic violence across the borders and all these amazing things. I think we hear very often in conversations on the mistakes of the crime bill, which we know are plentiful and really manifest across the bill, that VAWA is one of the things worth saving in it. It's very often the narrative. And so I want to ask y'all, you know, kind of going through this smokescreen, what are the actual implications and consequences of VAWA? What changed materially for kind of people's lives? What will the challenges of it? What were the real issues with it? So like, just kind of break it down for us through the mythology of kind of the fetishization of VAWA. What actually were the implications? What actually came out of it?
I mean, that map that you saw with the mandatory arrest and pro-arrest policies across the country was one of the main impacts of VAWA. And as Janae and others were saying, like, that literally in the moment increased the number of arrests of women in some jurisdictions like LA by twofold in domestic violence situations. Those folks, I mean, not to gender, it's not always gendered, you know, male abuser, you know, female identified survivor, but that suggests a really high increase in arrests of survivors. And other studies have found that of survivors who are arrested in mandatory arrest or dual arrest situations, 2/3 are Black and Latine, and 2/3 are people who are living under the poverty line, and many had previous violence calls. So it's that data suggesting that the folks who are being arrested are survivors. And there's more recent research that shows that increasingly girls are being arrested, or youth are being arrested in their homes when they are experiencing violence, maybe defending themselves, maybe not, maybe the parents just calling the cops because there's a confrontation. And that's becoming one of the primary pathways for youth, young women and trans youth, in particularly Black and Native women and trans youth, into the criminal punishment system. So I just really want to emphasize, like, there is more violence because of VAWA, because now survivors are experiencing violence at home and the violence of arrest. And everybody, I just want to emphasize, like, an arrest when you called for help or someone called for help for you is the fundamental rug being pulled out from under you, because that's the state telling your abuser, really, it's just all good. In fact, it's reinforcing that you're in the wrong. Abusers have learned to use this system as a tool, as they use anything, really. And it has just really increased opportunities for violence, and it hasn't decreased violence in the ways that Biden is claiming. I mean, the number of calls to a particular hotline may be down, but that's because research shows that almost half of DV survivors never call anyone, and that those numbers are going up. The number of DV survivors who don't engage the system is going up. Why? Because they know there's a cop on the other end. And many of them have experienced violence from cops, not just the violence of arrest and being put in cuffs and thrown in the back of a car and, you know, put in a jail cell and going through that system, which is inherently violence, but actually cops responding to violence with physical violence, sexual violence, verbal abuse. I wrote a whole chapter about it. Like it is not a one-off thing. It's actually in the 30 years of research I've done and talking to clients and people in community. One of the primary sites of police violence against Black women, queer and trans people is when their cops are answering calls for help. And one of the primary sites of sexual violence by cops is when they're answering DV calls or answering rape calls. And they literally say, when I'm coming in to, answer a DV call, I'm a knight in shining armor. Of course, I'm going to ask her on a date. Of course, I'm going to say, that you could do better with me. And they literally say it's like shooting fish in a barrel. Those are quotes from cops. And VAWA has empowered more cops to go into more homes to enact more violence, and has pushed more survivors away from calling for help because they know it comes with a cop, and either they've experienced that violence before, or like you said, they don't want to have the person who hurt them incarcerated. They want the violence to stop. They want an intervention in that moment, and they want tools to avoid, prevent, and interrupt and heal from violence, as Celia was saying. But instead what they get is a cop. And so people are like, you know what, I'm not doing it. And there's a really good example in Danielle Sered's book, sort of story where they're like, if there's one hamburger stand in the middle of the desert and it serves terrible hamburgers, the worst hamburgers, but that's all there is, there's a bunch of people who are going to do it and get the hamburger because they're hungry, and they'd be like, well, that was a good hamburger because there was nothing else. But there's a whole bunch of people driving by the hamburger stand saying, I don't care, like that hamburger is so bad, I'm going to go without. And so for me, that's what VAWA has done, is poured more money into systems of violence that are harming survivors, and pushed more survivors out of the way of assistance and support. And the last thing I'll say is that this money that goes to social service agencies that we heard about earlier, so 50% of it already is going to police and prosecutors. The other money that's going to services often comes conditioned on collaboration with police. Literally, a person can't get a thing unless they collaborate with police, or the agency has to have a memorandum of understanding signed with the police department to get the money. And so that is makes it that even survivors might not call 911, but they won't even go to the services anymore, because they're either in the precinct or in a family justice center that is focused on cops and prosecution, or they know that their social worker works in collaboration with cops. There might be a cop in the waiting room, and they're undocumented, and they're like too much risk under Trump particularly, but also under Biden. So I think I really want to push back against the notion that, Joe Biden's like the numbers are going down. It's like, that means fewer survivors are finding in this system anything that is useful to them, even in the worst situations of danger. And that's why efforts to kind of shift approaches, defund police, invest in survivor-based safety strategies are survivor-led. We want more for people like ourselves and the people we love and care about than this system is offering. And so I just want to offer that to people who are like, how can you attack VAWA? It helps some people. It's the only thing that's available. It's the only way we're getting survivor support. Like, we can imagine so much more for survivors, and survivors are saying with their feet by not calling that they want so much more and different, that we're really duty bound to pay attention. And I'll drop in the chat a statement from a number of coalitions of service providers who finally sort of came to that realization after, I don't know how many years, Janae, of people yelling at them about it, but came to that realization, acknowledged that this summer, and recognized that this path of VAWA was the wrong path for survivors, and not just Black and brown survivors, but for so many survivors.
I really feel like this could have been a one-woman panel. Like, it could have just been Andrea. No, but I also just want to highlight, like, there were a few recommendations for reading that you mentioned, Andrea, but I just want to highlight yours. Andrea has a book called Invisible No More, Police Violence Against Black Women and Women of Color, in which there is a whole chapter on police responses to violence, like when police respond to intimate partner violence or other forms of violence. And so, yeah, I encourage y'all to get that. Please hype yourself up, Andrea. But yeah, there was just so much there. I don't have much to add, except that, VAWA is carceral feminism manifested, right? it's literally a law that increased policing, arrests, and criminalization. And so when state control is increased in the lives of caretakers, particularly mothers in particular, that also increases their contact with the intervention of the child abuse and neglect system. And so, the increased involvement of the criminal legal system means greater scrutiny of women's parenting and an increased likelihood that mothers can lose their children, especially in instances of dual arrest, right? So that I think is super important. And just as a social worker by training, I just really want to just highlight and reiterate Andrea's point around collaborations. I think so. I mean, VAWA has built-in funding mechanisms for both the criminal legal system proper and explicitly, but also just I think what I think of as additional arms of the criminal legal system, which includes the child welfare system and social services that are literally bound to the criminal legal system by this funding mechanism. So, VAWA encouraged anti-violence nonprofit organizations to collaborate with the criminal legal system as a condition of funding, which diverted staff and resources and just attention away from other facets of responses to violence. And so that is huge. I don't have the current day, like fiscal year 2021 or 2022 numbers on this, but there's a book called Decriminalizing Domestic Violence, where there's numbers as of 2017 of, so just think overall, there's billions of dollars that are awarded in grants through the Office on Violence Against Women, right? The majority of that funding is dedicated to the criminal legal system. From the first year of its passage in 1992, 62% of our funds were dedicated to the criminal legal system, and the rest, 38%, went to social services. Come 2017, that number has decreased to like less than 15% to social services. And I'm not saying that social service in and of itself is without problems, right? Because there are carceral logics that are kind of embedded in social services, whether or not they explicitly collaborate with police or not, but that's a whole nother panel. but that funding contingency is super important. VAWA allocated $30 million to housing in fiscal year 17, despite so many studies showing that housing is the single greatest need identified by people subjected to abuse. And this is out of literally billions of dollars. And so all that to just highlight the even in this in the People's Coalition for Safety and Freedom, this is notion that budgets are moral documents, right? Like the way that the state, whether you're talking local all the way up to federal, the way that the state spends its dollars is a reflection of what your priorities are and what you deem as important. So this increasingly like inverse relationship between funding to the criminal legal system and funding to social services as it relates to violence against women, literally built into the act, it's a reflection of what the state sees as important. So that collaboration is something as a social worker that holds an abolitionist praxis, like that is really a place where I see the most potential for change when it comes to VAWA. And I'm sure we'll get into that more in this panel as well.
Thank you so much. Go ahead, Tim.
And I wanted to add something in regards to VAWA. As someone who is justice impacted myself, someone who is a domestic violence survivor myself, someone who just 2 years ago, I had to get a order of protection for myself because of my sister. She was in a relationship with somebody and he came and broke my windows looking for her, right? It took me a whole year to get an order of protection. But there's all this money supposedly being spent on VAWA and protections. But when you're going to get protection, in this whole year that I waited to get this order of protection, I was threatened 3 more times by this man. Never was there a true investment into either relocating me, if I was in real danger, buying me cameras, getting more police officers, maybe to just do wellness checks. Like, who's directing where the funding goes from BAWA? Because $9 billion, right, are spent. Half of it is spent in policing, which does nothing for nobody. Because even in the policing, if they spent that money by training, right, or constant education by system survivors, led by centering survivors, teaching the police how to deal with certain situations instead of, getting some dictator to say, hey, this is how these people should be treated, right? None of that's implemented. There's no, counseling. There's nothing in regards to coping, or even like when the police officers leave one scene and go to another, they might just had a real traumatic episode that happened and they haven't even had a time to decompress or, go through that motion with what they just seen or went through, and they're off to the next call, and that bias is coming with them, right? There's just like, I think about it, and I think about most of the money is federal grants. So that to me says anyone who's a grassroots Black and brown org, they're not seeing any of that funding, but yet we're doing all the real work. We're in the trenches. We're going to the people. We're there. We're holistically supporting these people, but yet we don't see any of the funding poured into investments in our community. I can only speak for the city of Chicago. I've been home for 20 years now, and there's still only like 3 transitional houses for women. And the homeless shelters, forget about it. I'll give you an example. The biggest homeless shelter that we have here on the west side of Chicago hosts 206 men, huge, empty, dorm room looking place, 32 lottery beds for women in a real dark, creepy part of that homeless shelter. I would not stay there. How are you going to be protected? There's one door to walk in and out of that room, and there's 200 men. How am I going to feel safe? There's not a space if you have children. Even in the domestic violence shelters here in Chicago, if you have a 12-year-old son, he has to go somewhere else. There's no way in hell I'm going to leave my son anywhere. He could be harmed. So they say that they're doing all these things, but yet the people that come from communities like mine, that look like me, are not receiving any of the resources, any of the VAWA money. None of this is coming to me. I should have felt something. I had nothing when I came home. I had no support system. That's how I created my non-for-profit, because I became what I needed when I came home for other people. It changes the game when you are welcomed home by a village of other survivors, system supporters, right? That understand that you need so many levels of help and resources. And we're here showing up, no judgment, no disparities, just a community really praying for your success, guiding you in your success, giving you what you need at that moment. That changes the game, especially in the first 60 days, where we as women, most jobs, I say that prison has always been a man thing, right? Most resources are surrounded around men. And then when you come home, most jobs that are available with somebody with a record are warehouse jobs. Physically, we're not able to do that for 8 hours a day, lifting 50 or 60 pounds. Women are not supposed to do that, we're made differently. So, and then most of us are mothers. We have to take time out to do the parenting classes so we can get our kids back. But yet I can't go live nowhere because you keep, turning me down because of housing barriers, right? Everyone knows just not having a house is a health hazard, and it's a condition, right? The worst. You have no foundation. So if I'm homeless, that means my kids are homeless. And due to all the barriers that we face as someone with a record, that generational harm is bestowed upon our children. They never asked to be shamed or wear our numbers, but in society, in America, they wear them. And, and it's sad because they become the next number due to the harm that's put on from the systems that swear they're trying to help us. But, I just want to know, like, when do small grassroots companies that do the work that are not federally attached to these huge orgs with all these fancy names, right? And, when do the people really get the investments that need it?
Yeah, there's a few things you said I really just I want to lift up, and I think it bridges to this question of like, if not this, then what? But I think there's a few really important things. One is just the failures of policing, right? And so I think this idea that all this money is being invested into a system that is deeply, deeply corrupt and violent, as I think Andrea said. And so not only, you can't train police officers out of raping women. Those are not things we can actually fix. And that this system is investing in purveyors of violence to solve violence, and that's just not possible. And I think your experience around, even when you decide to engage the system, that it meets that with violence, it meets that with ignoring the needs, it meets that with failure, I think is a really important one. And then as Andrea and Janae said, I think, that what VAWA has resulted in is not only, as you spoke to, kind of the failures of policing, but also more survivors in cages, more children in cages, more families that have been destroyed by the child welfare system, that becomes intrusive at the site of arrest, that begins to probe and be even more violent in separating parents from their children, especially survivors, and also increased opportunities of violence. The police now have opportunities for violence. Abusers game this system to use it to have power over survivors. And so just all the ways that VAWA is in fact inflicting more violence as opposed to less, I think is really important. And then I think that you touched on that I think is a good bridge is what is not being invested in. And so we know that the types of services that will actually support our folks, that will keep us safe, whether that's housing, whether that's community support that you spoke about, whether that's getting police out of our neighborhoods, out of our schools, out of our homes, so that we're safer, that comes at the expense of funding the police in the trillions of dollars and funding cages. So I want to move to that question as well of what is it that keeps us safe? I know that survivors, system involved folks who have survived this system have been dreaming and scheming and implementing solutions to violence for the last few decades, if not centuries. Right? We have been survivors. And so I'm curious, and this is open to everybody, what are some solutions that survivors have and advocates have developed and implemented and advanced instead of costly solutions? And so if we're saying that we know and we've seen the way that policing, the way that cages actually don't keep us safe, that they inflict more violence, what else are people developing and implementing, whether it's on a small scale or a large scale? And the things that are not getting funded, as you mentioned, what are those things? What does that look like? And anyone can start that one.
Sure, I can start. So in BYP 100's story collection project, which is part of the She Safe, We Safe campaign, we literally kind of asked this question. So over 1,400 Black folks responded to a survey in which we asked, amongst other things, what kinds of resources and systems need to exist for women and girls and trans and gender nonconforming people to be safe? Like what types of programs and structures need investment? And so there were several themes that came up. So one major one was comprehensive education and awareness, particularly political education, as like building a shared analysis around gender-based violence, misogyny, patriarchy, and white supremacy through a gender lens. The need for comprehensive sex education in schools and educational programs for people who cause harm as part of accountability were also recurring themes. Political education, especially for cisgender heterosexual men and boys, and education as a mechanism of accountability for people who cause harm was like one kind of major category that came up. The other was safe, short, and long-term housing. Many respondents raised all types of housing as a critical resource for safety, including more long-term affordable housing as well as short-term emergency housing like shelters. I think it's important to note that, as Celia mentioned, like not all shelters are safe or, without its own problems, right? And so, I think we should distinguish between kind of like these state-sanctioned shelters and community shelters and what their rules and policies are. No to low-cost mental health care was a huge theme. Survey responses mentioned counseling or therapy that we could actually afford, and our implemented by competent professionals. People talked a lot about streamlining the process of inaccessibility to Black and queer therapists and trauma-centered therapists is super important. Skills training was a big thing, most notably like self-defense. Respondents believe that self-defense classes should be free and widely accessible locally. And like cash or financial support was really important. I think that generally people subjected to abuse want economic security, right? They want the ability to pay their monthly bills and meet their basic needs and have money left over for entertainment or savings. And especially in instances where your abuser you might be very much financially intertwined with your abuser. Financial support is important. So participants supported the idea of like unrestricted cash, like not, pennies telling you exactly what to do with it, rub them together and wish for more. No, like folks talked about like a basic monthly income, or just other financial resources for survivors. Of course, access to free healthcare, like many things that like we all generally need to be safe, right? But are particularly is just even more important for someone who is trying to escape or get away from an abusive relationship and start and be empowered in starting a life on their own, separate from an abusive relationship. And there are several others that I can name in terms of like major themes from the story collection project, but two more I will mention is one is funding for local community-based organizations to provide services, develop innovative programs, et cetera, that are totally separate from the criminal legal system, and especially organizations that combine social services with political organizing and advocacy. And the last one I'll say is just the last kind of broad major categories: collective community intervention and rapid response. Folks talked a lot about just like kind of a grassroots approach to crisis response and rapid response. 24-hour DV crisis responders, healing justice teams. Like folks came up with a lot of different kind of ideas of what community safety could look like. And a running theme through a lot of them was that like we could have funding for things like this if like our state wasn't so invested in policing, right? And I mean policing broadly defined, not just like your local police department proper, but policing is a vast system that includes people who are and are not in uniform, right? And so, generally as funding for anti-violence efforts remain focused on criminal legal system, criminalization will continue to deprive efforts to develop alternatives of needed resources. And last thing I'll say in terms of like what types of solutions have survivors and advocates developed and implemented instead of carceral solutions is just even in conceptualizing the story collection project as part of the She Safe, We Safe campaign. We draw a lot of inspiration from creative interventions and their storytelling and organizing project. And for folks who don't know Creative Interventions, it was a Bay Area organization that was really among the first to develop, one of the first organizations to develop a non-policing, non-systems, community-based approach to address all forms of intimate partner and sexual violence. It was established back in 2004 by one of the co-founders of Insight, which Andrea mentioned earlier. And essentially, it kind of started as a resource center that housed a pilot project to develop a collective non-policing intervention approach, and created the Storytelling and Organizing Project as like a clearinghouse for stories of everyday collective responses that could kind of reshape a public imagination when it came to policing as a form of justice. And in a nutshell, what Creative Interventions did was kind of radically shift the focus from organization-based service delivery to one that supported interventions that were carried out in the homes and neighborhoods where violence occurred by those closest to the situation of violence. Like Celia mentioned earlier, a quote from Glenn Martin, which I also use regularly, that those closest to the problem, closest to the solution. What Creative Interventions did was kind of position the survivor along with their chosen, support network as experts on the situation of violence. Focus on the factors that could bring safety and accountability, and focus on the cultural conditions surrounding the violence that might act as barriers or pathways to change. And so, I'm not saying that, community accountability, which is essentially kind of what they were doing systematically, but I'm not saying that it's easy, because community accountability requires a lot. It requires people who are in relationship with each other. It requires like someone who is actually like ready to step into accountability, because accountability is an active thing. It's not passive. You have to like consent and actually step into it. And it's time intensive, right? Like healing doesn't happen overnight. But it is promising in terms of actually like addressing the root cause of violence and actually healing for the survivor, and like what the survivor needs to feel whole, right? And also transforming the person who caused harm to position themselves as not continuing to cause that harm, right? And so I would posit creative interventions like as an organization that understood like the goal was to kind of work themselves out of existence, like basically do the work that they shouldn't have to exist anymore as an organization, to continue to hold those processes, right? I feel like I've been talking for a minute, so I'm gonna pause there and let Andrea and Celia get in on this.
Thank you so much, Janae. I actually want to, there's some really good questions in the chat box. Also, the chat box is on file for folks who aren't in it. There's resources, books, shout outs, all the things. But I want to just lift up two questions out of it, one of which I think is related to this question as well, which comes from Sarah, which is what kinds of systems can we put into place that will both hold abusers accountable and keep survivors safe, and give the survivors the support they need. And so I think combining that question around kind of systemic shifts and changes and investments with the one I just asked around what are the things that folks have been trying and testing. I don't know if there are other thoughts on that folks can weigh in, and let's try and do that in the next 5 minutes, and then we'll ask the last question. But I don't know, Celia or Andrea, if y'all want to weigh in on that one.
I think everything that Janae said, and Interrupting Criminalization and Project NIA launched a site today called 1 Million Experiments, another Mariam Kaba brainchild, in addition to Transform Harm, which is also in the chat. And I think the answer, it's because the answer is there's no one thing. As Celia said, it depends, it's as individual as the survivor and her situation. Like, another light-skinned Black woman down the block who has a similar situation is going to need something different than I have, right? Like, it's a different situation. Obviously, all the vectors or the axes of identity from there are going to need something different. And so I think the notion that we have to have a one-size-fits-all solution is part of the problem. And people keep saying, like, we can't let this go until we have the other thing in place. There is no one other thing, right? And Mariam reminded me today that Damon Williams in Chicago was the person who said, whenever I see a cop, I see 1,000 jobs smashed into one person with a gun. And there's 1,000 things people need, and we're trying to find the one solution. And we're not going to solve the problem if we're like, okay, now the caseworker is the one person with 1,000 things smashed into one. Everything Janae laid out is what people need. If you look at the Creative Interventions Toolkit, it's 400 pages long, because there's that many kind of options and choose your own adventure that even that group came up with, because it's as different as each individual survivor in each moment of time. What I need today might be different than what I need tomorrow. So I want to push back on that, and also just quickly answer another question, which was, okay, cool, we agree, but we're in the VAWA reauthorization and nothing else is possible. So, and there's money that does go to services, even if they are tied with law enforcement in VAWA. What are we supposed to say, because there's nothing else that's possible. And I think what I want to say is, we owe survivors more than settling for what Joe Biden tells us is possible. And so I think the Moment of Truth letter outlines a framework of us saying we're not accepting this anymore. And I think that the anti-violence advocates who have been engaged through VAWA, have been pushing for the reauthorization, can, if everyone is together, stands together, say, actually, we're just not doing this again. Sorry, this doesn't work for almost half of survivors. So we refuse this. We want something else. In some way, like then Biden wouldn't be able to say, I reauthorized VAWA and I did good by survivors. And so there's a not just a power, there's a principle to hold and a power to wield. And I think people are afraid of doing that because budgets are at stake, jobs are at stake, and survivors' lives are at stake. But I think that what we've heard today makes it clear that we have to insist that at least, some portion of that money go in a different way, in some way. So I don't know, Janae has maybe a better idea.
Well, I also wanted to weigh in and say that one of the things that I had, that is always missing from a lot of these pictures of the necessities people think that we need. And one of the biggest things is the holistic approach and support, peer-led, right? The emotional intelligence that needs to be reprogrammed from all the subliminal messages that we've received and, just subdued since we've been children, and the violence that we generationally carry in our DNA as well, as Black and brown people who survived centuries of oppression. There's it's not just what's happening now, but it's what is genetically a part of who we are today, right? And until we can get to that spiritual support, that reprogramming of the emotional intelligence, because when someone's been harmed and then we go into counseling, just because we have counseling and we're okay for the now, that doesn't mean that I'm not going to need it again 5 years from now, 2 years from now, or that something's going to re-trigger me and send me into a deep depression. The women that I deal with, I have a lady that I helped when I first came home in 2001, and she just reached out to me. She's having a bad time. I haven't talked to this lady in 20 years, but my number's always been the same. When you are facing constant barriers, there's 1.3 million women right now under criminal supervision. That means there's millions of children that are living a life of a less fortunate life than other children who don't have someone who has a record in their family. We don't look at them harms. We don't look at the family needs, right? And we don't look at the ripple effect of you're punishing this person, but you're punishing that whole family. You're punishing that whole community, because that woman is connected to all of that. We all are connected to each other. And until we start recognizing what scientists recognize, right? That there's an emotional intelligence that lives inside of our heart that no one can explain, right? I call them God, but other people can call them what they want. When are we going to get to that human aspect part, right? That we cry, that we bleed, and that we need help. Sometimes it's a hug that we need. Sometimes it's that person just sitting there listening to me vent that I need. There's not a budget line item for that. And that's what people have to realize and understand. We're human beings. We're not some kind of, computer that you can put together and kind of find out what works and what doesn't work for that system, and that's a lot of why, things don't get to the root cause, because people are really scared to get to that root cause sometimes.
Thank you so much for that, Celia. I think, go ahead, Janae, you want to?
I just wanted to say something super quickly, and that's I could totally completely agree with what Celia said in terms of like there are things that there are just not budget line items for, period, that people need, and I think just in thinking about VAWA's reauthorization or potential reauthorization, I think I just want to explicitly say, even though it's been implied throughout this whole conversation, that VAWA is a really great place where the defund police demand can be implemented. I think Elisa Bieria was the first to coin the idea of like a decarceral VAWA. But in thinking about that, like VAWA itself has done very, very little to address individual or structural economic issues, which is kind of implicated in a lot of things that we've been talking about today. why can't, you know, X amount of VAWA funding, you know, be made available to for cash transfer programs, or, you know, to see community revitalization efforts, or, you know, to pilot microfinancing. Like, just there are things that VAWA funding can be used for explicitly. VAWA funding could and should be diverted from prosecution to restorative practices without, you know, contingency to collaborate with the legal system in any way. You know, again, funding to local organizations, community-based organizations that are already, you know, doing this work, or even funding to collectives that don't have 501c3 status, because we all know about the nonprofit industrial complex. That's also a whole nother panel. But like, how can funding, this VAWA funding, these millions, billions of dollars in funding, you know, be directed towards these community-based institutions and practices that decouple the idea of safety from policing and prosecution, that's informed by, you know, some type of community-based process. I mean, there are line items that can be made, right? And also, you know, recognizing that there are things that, you know, can't put a dollar amount on, but, you know, there are plenty of things that we can. So I just want to, you know, name that.
Thank y'all so much. We're almost at time, but I feel like not only did this panel give both like 5 other potential panels that we should all have together, because there was so much here, but also I think this bottom line that you just really lifted up, Janae, which is that there are a million solutions, not just one, to how we can end interpersonal and intimate violence, but none of them are more violence. None of them mean more police or more cages or more families torn apart. And so I just want to thank y'all for bringing different things, whether it's thinking about, Celia, as you said, kind of holistic responses to violence, whether it's systemic changes like housing, like moving the trillions of dollars we invest in cages and police to things like housing, to things like healthcare, to things like mental health support that are being abandoned in the name of building more prisons and putting more cops on the street. And just recognizing how incredibly, inherently, and deeply violent police actually are, to Andrea's point and in Andrea's book, which y'all should read. So I want to thank y'all so much. I think very often in the conversations about VAWA, we don't actually uncover the truth. And it's hard to say, as you said, Andrea, that the police and more prisons aren't the solution to violence. It's more complicated. And in fact, there are much deeper and much longer conversations we have to have. But it's a lie to say that more police will keep women, femmes, and other folks who are survivors safe. And so I want to thank y'all so much for telling the truth tonight, for sharing all of the expansive ways that we can keep ourselves safe outside of these criminal legal systems and these cages. And thank each of you for your bravery in doing the work that you do. So thank y'all, and I'll pass it back. Oh, and I also want to say, as I said, there has been lit activity in the chat. There's a lot of resources folks have lifted up. All of these folks are part of or leaders of organizations that are doing amazing work. And so we will include all of that, hopefully in our follow-up, so that folks can follow these folks. We also have everyone's handle, if you're a social media person, and lots of resources. And so we really do want folks to engage in a long-term, deep study about why it is that carceral responses to violence are so harmful, are so devastating, and what we can do together to build something else. So I want to thank y'all so much, and I'll pass it to Cameron to close us out and let y'all know how you guys can get involved and engaged with us.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you again to Marbury and our amazing panelists for just being so candid with us and really digging deeper into VAWA and its shortcomings and how it does not actually stop and prevent violence. And I just want to uplift that I appreciate everyone's questions. If you're like me, I'm also a solutions-oriented person. So briefly, I'm Cameron Bell. I am the People's Process Coordinator for the People's Coalition, and just want to give you a quick overview into where we're headed next. You can figure out how you want to get plugged in. So next slide, we'll see kind of those immediate next steps. So first of all, our objectives are really to catalyze national attention to repeal and replace the 1994 crime bill with proposals that come through and come out of the people's process. We want to center the stories and expertise of communities and individuals that are most impacted. And we want to support local power and capacity and support ongoing local work. We also want to engage in mass political education for folks to deepen and develop and transform our understanding of the prison industrial complex. And we also plan to co-develop language and priority investments for a replacement of the 94 bill that will reverse its impact and reduce the footprint of incarceration. And really and truly want to imagine the alternatives to incarceration and safety and bring people together to discuss what actually keeps us safe outside of the carceral state. So similar to the grounding activity that Tracy led us through in the beginning, right? What makes us feel safe? What is a good day? What is a safe day? And what are the investments needed and the policies needed to be in place to make that possible, make that happen, and not just be a dream space, right? We want to make this real for all of us. So you can get plugged in. Is your org already engaging in this work and abolition focused work? Do you want to do this work with us and co-create and reimagine what safety means and what we need to achieve it? I invite you to go to our website, check us out, see more about what we're doing, what we're trying to do, and sign up. You can follow us on social media. If you've been following us on Twitter, you'll see we had live tweets going while we had this panel. So definitely follow us on social and then sign up in our interest form so we can really get connected and get you plugged into this work, because really we're dreaming big, but we can't do it without you, right? It's called the people's process for a reason. We want to really turn how we write legislation on its head. So it is focused on what the people want and not just what elected officials say is in our best interest. So their links are in the chat, the socials are in the chat. You will also get a one-pager follow-up in the follow-up email with all the resources that we mentioned earlier. So stay tuned for that. And we really and truly thank you so much for taking time out of your evening to sit with us this evening, learn some more, ask your questions, and kind of dig deeper into what we need to be safe and to stop violence. So please stay safe, be well, and feel free to share this. Thank you all again.